Hi, Dr. Laurent Bannock. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. How are we doing today?
Good, Gabe. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This is fun to be on the other side of the podcast for once.
Yeah, well, it's really exciting to have you here. And listen, if you want to take over at any point and, run the show, then I'm happy to, defer to you. So no problem.
Yeah, no, after hundreds of episodes of podcasting, I can tell you it's an absolute pleasure to not actually be the host. Nothing wrong with being the host, Gabe, but yeah, for once.
Well, I understand that you're going through quite the heat wave, maybe untraditional heat wave out there in the UK. Is that right?
The term heat wave and UK doesn't normally combine, but we are having quite the time over here, and British people being British, we like to talk about the weather all the time. And yeah, we're crazy. We're going crazy with the hot weather, but we complain if it's cold, we complain if it's hot. So there you go.
So, question for you: being on the performance nutrition side, you mentioned, your kids are running around on a hot summer day like this. I imagine they're going to run in and they want some ice cream or some popsicles. Now, is that something they're getting, or are they getting a nice, healthy alternative to that?
So, as a sports nutritionist and as an expert, a researcher, and so on, I like to go by the rule that that we a lot of us tend to subscribe to, which is to do as I say, but not as I do. No, they'd be getting their ice cream for sure. Anyway, there'd be a riot, and it's just not worth it. Uh, but when we talk about sports nutrition for athletes and elite performance and so on, we'll see that nothing is off the table. It's just a question of when and how often. And so it goes with my kids, who maybe have it more often than maybe they should, but not too much. You've got to keep the little critters happy.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to dive into that today. And really, to start us off with this conversation, I'd be curious what drew you into this world of performance nutrition? Like, how did you even get to this point?
It's a very good question. And because I've been doing this for decades now, my career in health and fitness, we shall say, is nearing 30 years. I can't believe I'm saying that. It's frightening. I'm 52 and I got into this in my early 20s. I experimented with a few things before really dedicating myself to health and fitness. But ultimately, performance nutrition or sports nutrition became bit of an obsession over the years, but I didn't start as a sports nutritionist. I actually started in health and fitness as a personal trainer and a strength conditioning coach. And for quite a few years, actually, for a good 10 years, I worked in that area in private sort of one-to-one stuff back in the days when people didn't really have PTs, particularly in the UK. In the US, it was in the big cities, celebrities and so on were getting PT. But in the UK, we were just catching on, and I was lucky to be doing that in London and elsewhere. Had my own gym. That didn't go so well after a few years of running my own gym. A massive health and rackets club opened up opposite me and basically took all the parking, and that killed my business. So I quickly realized that running my own facility and having overheads and all those sorts of things was possibly not where I wanted to go. But on reflection, that ended up being a really good lesson to learn. And by that, I mean the concept of overheads. A lot of practitioners, we get obsessed, whether you're a PT or a strength conditioning coach or a nutritionist or whatever, we all get obsessed with science and theory and the stuff that links to our job title, right? But being a practitioner and being successful as a practitioner, depending on how you define successful, of course, involves a lot more than that. Things like implementation, operation, and all sorts of things. So I was lucky, I guess. I mean, I had a messy period of my early years, shall we say, where I'd experimented with a lot of things as a PT. I mean, for a start, there was no jobs. So it was very much a self-employed gig, so you got to get work. And you would diversify. So I diversified a lot, and I got into alternative medicine, I got into all sorts of weird stuff, did all sorts of courses, certifications. Some were a little bogus, I think. Well, no, they were pretty bogus back in the day. Everything was available, and all PTs are subjected to this. Healthcare professionals, the more regulated there tends to be stricter stuff in this regard. But when you're in the health and fitness industry, there's There's a lot. And nowadays we see that, of course, with influencers and coaches running their own courses and so on. So, of course, we've got the bigger names that we know beyond university. You've got your degrees, obviously, but you've also got professional certifications and so on. So, anyway, I'd explored a lot in that area back in those days. And having owned my own business and trying to make a few bucks here and there, you go through some interesting experiences. But ultimately, what became obvious at that point in my life was I'm not going to get anywhere unless I get results, right? Results are what gets you the referrals. Results is what gets you repeat business from your clients, your customers. Results is your reputation at the end of the day. So that became my focus. And when I was a PT and an S&C coach in different environments, I often found, because my clients were wanting to work with me primarily for body composition change, that's really common in the PT environment. Yes, people want to be healthier, and people want stronger bones, more robust cardiovascular systems, and other challenges they might be dealing with. But I mean, almost always they want to look good. In their swimming outfits when on holiday, or they just, for their own personal state of mind, their emotional situation beyond just health and other factors like that. You don't get very far if you don't get results. And clients are an interesting species, as we all know, whether they're midlifers, whether they're parents, whether they're elite athletes, businessmen. They could be triathletes, so they're highly focused on one angle, or they're really reluctant exercisers and they just don't really want to be training. You have to find ways to get those results. So I think it's an underestimated skill set of practitioners to be highly effective as a practitioner, as a PT, as an S&C coach, getting results out of your clients. Unless your client's going to live with you all day and you literally just live in the gym, and it's really not that easy when you only see them once, twice, 3 times a week. And so it goes with athletes too. So there's a huge amount in there that I found I needed to diversify. And like I say, some of those paths were a bit dodgy, I think, back at alternative and so on. But I did what I did. I was curious, and I've always been that way. But I reset and decided to go on a path, but I always found that nutrition was the big one. It was the food, the alcohol, the wine, the cookies, the big meals, the eating out, the dinners and so on, which had the biggest impacts on what their goals were. So I spent more time trying to influence their lifestyle, their nutrition, their habits, and that became my real big focus. So I retrained, and early-ish on into that portion of my career, actually I had an opportunity to go to the States. Went to the States, ended up doing my master's in exercise science and health promotion at California University of Pennsylvania. Then I've changed names to Penn West, I think. And that was my first sort of proper dive into proper education stateside, and then I ended up doing other qualifications and other things. But I always found myself coming back to nutrition, but I didn't gravitate so much to people, like the sort of morbidly obese type clients. I always really enjoyed the ones that were really ambitious about their body composition, about their performance. So I worked in lots of different areas, but ultimately I kept coming back to the performance side and found myself pretty much working with 2 types of clients. And it would either be what we call recreational athletes. It's the gym bros, the people looking for really quite serious body composition changes, from amateur bodybuilders to triathletes, all those sorts of things. And then, once you're in that world and you get half decent at what you do, your reputation gets out there, and I started working with elite athletes. And anyway, I did that for quite a long time, stateside, came back to the UK and did the same thing. But throughout that period, I just got more and more into sport and exercise nutrition, at the same time upskilling myself and so on and so forth. But this is back early on. Sports science is a relatively young discipline, strength conditioning is a young discipline, sports nutrition is a really young discipline, and we're still playing catch up, I feel, with other allied areas, whether it's obviously medicine's been around a long time, nursing practice and so on. And by catch up, I mean it's less about the theory and more about the practice bit. to circle back on what I was saying, it's about getting results. Getting results is a lot more than just having knowledge about metabolism, knowledge about exercise physiology. You've got to be able to understand how to interpret evidence, science, research. You've got to understand your clients, and there's a lot in there which we can get into deeper later on in our conversation. But like I said, ultimately it just kept coming back to, for me at least, I found nutrition was the biggest lever I could pull effectively to help my clients get the results that they wanted, and that just kept getting me more and more obsessed with nutrition and performance nutrition in general.
Okay, awesome. So, as a strength conditioning coach or a personal trainer, you mentioned that you started to think about operations, right? It's much more than
Yeah,
just the education piece. A lot of it is operations. You have to also run a business, right? It's not
you
just, hey,
do.
you know what to do and when to do it, but you have to now put this into practice and actually run the business. So, as you started to pivot into nutrition, did you see this opportunity to have a better performing operational system in place, feeling that you could reach more people and also not have to
Yeah,
be on the floor for 10 to 11 hours a day in order
absolutely.
to run your business?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if what you have is a job with somebody else, you're working in a facility, right? You don't always appreciate what it takes to get clients in front of you, get clients to part with money, right? And to stay. It's a big deal. And the bigger businesses obviously have a big machine behind them. They've got marketing, they've got all sorts of stuff going on. But if you're in a small group coaching environment, small group PT, you're a single operator, you've got to do it all yourself, and that's intimidating. And nowadays, I think that's the bigger likelihood you're going to find yourself in. There's less and less opportunities to find work as an employee, or at least it's going to be very transient, that role. You might have a job in a gym or a health and fitness facility, or what in the UK we call a leisure centre or whatever, or even in a sports team. I mean, from one season to the next, you're highly likely to find yourself looking for work. It's a really difficult scenario, which is why you've got to be able to learn how to diversify your skill set as a coach and as a practitioner, and be your own employer, your own marketing machine. Networking, all these sorts of things are critical, and they all form the successful practitioner, the elite practitioner, shall we say. And by elite, by the way, I just mean literally what that term means is better than most, right? You're better than most at getting results. You're better at most. I used the phrase reputation earlier. If you don't have the reputation for getting results, then people aren't going to look for you. They're not going to recommend you. And so you want to be the best of the best, don't you? In whatever environment, it's something that's in your best interest. And of course, that will influence not just your ability to train and coach people. It's like, how do you package yourself? How do you market yourself? What do people see? And that influences things like buy-in, Gabe. I don't know, in your experience, it'd be interesting for you to say, but when you're working with somebody, like for example, if you're dressed badly, if you look like a hot mess, if you're always on your phone, if you're giving nutrition handouts that are just hand scribbled notes on a bit of paper, I mean, it's going to be kind of difficult to get buy-in. It's not going to be that convincing that you're good, right? Now, obviously, you learn these things over time, but obviously you learn from other people, like listeners to this podcast. You learn it from your teachers, your mentors. It's not the sort of thing, though, that they tend to teach in our educational programs, sadly. And that's a problem, because people then realize they need to upskill in some of these areas, and of course they go and find this information from all sorts of crazy places.
Yeah, so I'm curious. So Laurent, the nutritionist, now started on this journey, right? And
Yeah,
you still may have been involved with fitness, health, exercise, of course.
I
But
was.
now
Yeah,
you mentioned that you were working with ambitious people. You had these two pillars. You had these recreational athletes
yeah.
that were super motivated, gym bros, but then you also had these elite athletes. So take us through those early years of now working in performance nutrition and how that profession and those experiences started to evolve with time.
Well, I mean, so going from a more private sort of practice, you work in one to one with athletes, that's right, with clients, right? These are people who are paying you. It's a very intimate relationship you have with these people. You know, you get to know them, you spend quite a lot of time with them. Often, you know, like I'd go to their homes, I'd go check out their kitchens. I was also training them, and or I would go and be there with their trainer, or some of them would have personal chefs if they were wealthy. I mean, there's all sorts of scenarios there, right? But you've got a different environment than being in a professional team situation. Firstly, the athlete in a team isn't paying you. So right there you've got a bit of a problem because there's a different level of buy-in. Now, they might know that they've been told to work with you. They might know that they're expected to work with you, but that doesn't mean that they're invested in the idea of working with you. So all those things I talked about go up even higher levels. You know, your reputation. If you're a newbie to the team, you've just qualified. You know, you gotta work hard to get those things that are going to get you some respect out of the athletes, and it can be quite intimidating. I remember some horrendous experience, even though I was really experienced in the private sector, and I was at the time I was of an age where I wasn't a kid, and I was working in football, as in soccer teams and rugby teams, and sort of like a pack mentality. They you know, they can rib you a lot, as in make jokes, and you know, you got to have a very thick skin, and you know, there are some social skills that you need to get into that environment.
Absolutely, yeah.
That could be interesting, and you know, you learn things like just because you're sitting there with your laptop and a clipboard in the cafeteria or the changing room, it doesn't mean they're going to come up and talk to you. So you have to learn different ways of navigating those environments and how to get yourself in front of an athlete and have them share and buy into you. Because like I said, if they're not paying you, if they haven't, you know, done their research, found you online, booked in and have an appointment and so on, you know, those are many levels of buying decisions, if you like, that they make. Whereas with the athletes, it's very different. So I did find it difficult, and I remember my first team presentation was, this was a rugby team. I was sitting there, they all came in, and there was 20 guys, massive, like your American football players, like I'm you know, 6 foot, 200 pounds sort of thing. But these guys are monsters, you know. So, you know, you get past that initial shock of, geez, these guys are big, and you got a whole room of massive athletes. So what did I do? I did a PowerPoint presentation, took them through all the theory I thought that they should know about, you know, sports nutrition, hierarchy of evidence, you know, the importance of carbohydrates and how that influences adaptations to training and protein needs and leucine thresholds and all that stuff. So they saw me doing that. What did I see? I saw a bunch of players on their phones, looking out the window,
Right.
all that sort of stuff. And and then I was a bit naive, so I didn't realize I wasn't quite getting the engagement, you know. But I went and sat down with them. I did at least do this in the cafeteria, and they were like, "Boy, that's the worst presentation." That is the worst presentation. Like, I don't think I heard anything you said, you know. So what I learned from that, though, was I did at least get feedback. I did listen. And I did understand that was the first and only time I'm ever going to give that kind of presentation. So I then just sort of got in. I took the jokes, I took the criticism from them all, and started asking them, okay, well, what, you know, how do you want me to talk to you? Because no one had taught me this stuff at university.
Right.
No one.
Right.
So asking, but getting myself out there and going, do you know what? I'm going to pick myself up from this mess I'm in. And I'm going to at least go into this scenario and get some feedback. So instantly, the first thing you learn is you need to start learning about the people you're going to work with. Listen to them. Listen to what they want to hear, because they will tell you. They will tell you. And they've had team nutritionists or dietitians or whatever before. Often you'll learn why they didn't keep those practitioners.
Right.
And that can be pretty scary. They will give you all sorts of interesting feedback about what they did and didn't like about that person and why they didn't, you know, respect them and so on, which is, you know, you think, oh my God, I've got to deal with this. But what you're learning to do is to communicate and engage and talk to people. So from that point, I then started to operate on that basis of listening first, working out how to communicate. And then after a bit of trial and error, shall we say, you start to learn how to communicate. It's like any relationship, whether it's regular people, your buddies, in a classroom environment when you first do your presentations or whatnot. I think everyone kind of knows what I'm talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, a few things that you said really resonated with me. Number one, as a young practitioner, when I was a strength and conditioning coach getting into the team environment, you're so excited to finally have the opportunity to share everything that you've learned to prepare for this moment. So I'm kind of laughing alongside you when you're telling this story because I've been in that situation, not giving a PowerPoint, but going through all this information and over explaining because I'm so excited to share it.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the players, it's great, Gabe. Good job. Like, thank you. Okay, what are we doing today? Like,
No, it's
and
really important, Gabe. It's really important
and
because, go on, sorry.
yeah, and I think I went through that over time. I started meeting people, new players, new teams with questions, right?
Yeah.
Hey, let me just ask before I even start. Let me just figure out what's been going on here. Let me talk to the people who have been here before. Let me talk to the people who have been here for a long time, for a short time, and start to understand the dynamic before I maybe try to insert anything that I want to bring into this program.
Well, I think what happens is, in most cases, we've all got years of education behind us, right? And we love this stuff. We're an interesting breed in the health and fitness industry. We're all pretty obsessed by the whole thing. So, of course, you land there and you're like, dun, dun, dun. Everyone's sitting there and you just open your mouth and out just spews all the stuff that you're interested in, right? And, of course, what you don't realize is they're not interested in what you're interested in, at least not at the level, So it's just like, just shut up and tell me what to do. I don't care about all the science. And that's important because you then realize that you, as in the coach, the practitioner, you do need to understand the science, but you also need to understand how to translate that information into what is meaningful, impactful, and my favorite word currently, relevant for them to know. And that requires quite a lot of thinking, and that's something that my team and I spend a lot of time working on in our own research and our own educational activities is how do we actually address this stuff, because there's a big gap. There's a translational gap, which is one issue, but there's just a massive gap between science and practice for reasons that we've already started to delve into.
So you discussed being ingrained in the team environment, and I'm really excited to talk about that a little bit later in our conversation and more about what that was like. However, the other thing you had mentioned was translating knowledge into practice. So my question for you was, what inspired you to create the Institute of Performance Nutrition, right? I understand this was founded around 2011. So really in the field of performance nutrition, it seems like that translation into practice was one of the things that was missing. So was that really the impetus for creating the IOPN?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, basically, I'd come back from the States and I had my master's in exercise science and health promotion. I had a master's in nutrition and lots of experience working one-to-one in a more recreational setting. But as I started to work with more and more elite athletes, I was working with professional boxers, UFC fighters, a lot of soccer players privately, various rugby teams, I mean, all sorts of stuff. The military, did a lot of work with the military, special forces, stuff like that. But what I was finding was just, well, hang on, a lot of the stuff that was in the textbook wasn't really relevant to all these different contexts that I'm working in. And I'm like, oh man, I completely understand how important results are in these scenarios. But frankly, what I've just read in this book isn't really helping me. Like, what do I do? So, I've always been good at asking other people, hey, how would you do this? And that was actually one reason why I started my podcast. It was an opportunity to have a chat with somebody who was an expert on a topic. So it'd be like, well, hey, I need to understand more about protein needs, right? So I'm going to get Stu Phillips on. Or I need to understand more about nutrition, iron metabolism in athletes. So, okay, I'm going to talk to Professor Pete Peeling in Australia. Or, I mean, I could, I don't want to list millions of names in 300 podcasts. So that alone was eye-opening, right? And I was like, hang on. But what these people are saying is not the generalized stuff that was in the textbook. So I was in London and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to pull together some seminars. And we started doing sort of seminars. I'd get my mates working in teams and I'd invite experts to come and deliver little weekend lecture sessions. And that's kind of how that started at the time. Also, because in the States, I had got involved with the ISS, International Society of Sports Nutrition, back in those days, and we started running some courses for them as well. And ultimately, what happened was the sort of regular CPD lecture weekends started to morph into something more serious. And the little sort of day trainings, the 1 day sort of seminar events at weekends started to morph into a training program that developed over a period of time. That became more and more formal. And basically, as when I was stateside at an ISSN conference, actually, I was sitting at a bar with Brad Schoenfeld, Professor Brad Schoenfeld, who I'm sure all your listeners will know. And I was telling him about all this stuff, and it was him that told me. I was like, I'm not quite sure what to do. And he said, well, why don't you start your own institute? And it's one of those conversations you have over wine, but I did it. So I told him, when I interviewed Brad on one of my podcasts, I said, Brad, it was your idea. It was your idea, but I went with it. And it had various iterations, and it wasn't really until I was doing my own doctorate at Middlesex University in London that it became much more serious, where my own doctoral research, which was in bridging the gap between science and practice, and this is over 10 years ago now. And really what happened there is that my doctoral research ended up becoming the blueprint for what is now the IOPN. And those taught sort of seminar sessions are now what we now run is a series of professional and postgraduate training programs. We've just launched our new Master of Science degree, which is done in partnership with the University of Portsmouth here in the UK. It's our program, but we work with them to have it validated as a degree. Very proud of our journey and where we've come. It's not just me, it's my team. Most of my team are former students of mine, so I'm quite loyal to my students, former MSc students when I ran the MSc at Middlesex University in London, and former IOPN students. We've rebranded over time from various names, but that's where we are now as the Institute of Performance Nutrition. But everything we do, Gabe, is focused on this concept of applying the science into practice. And we're very unique in how we approach this. But that was really the impetus. I mean, it's over a decade of time to narrow down to a couple of minutes conversation, but that's what happened. It's like a snowball that just kept going and grew into this thing that we are now. And we now got students in 60 countries. And like I say, we've got various professional programs that we run, including our new master's degree.
You mentioned that the IOPN, the way you do things by connecting the bridge between science and practice, is unique. Well, what makes it unique?
We're unique because we've had an opportunity to develop everything we do from the ground up. We started from scratch. So most academic programs follow a fairly traditional format. In sports science, strength conditioning and so on, there will be similar formats to how they run. I should say strength conditioning is much more practice focused, right? Whereas typically if you're just going to do an exercise science degree, it's less practice focused. It's more about the science or the physiology. You might be doing in the lab some fitness tests and so on, but you're not really taught how to work with people, whereas at least in strength conditioning you are taught a lot more about how to coach people. That's not something that really exists in the sports nutrition environment. The dietitians will say, well, we're taught how to do that, and of course they are. Dietitians is a very specific area, but dietitians aren't trained in performance nutrition. They will upskill. We have lots of dietitians in the state doing our course in Europe and internationally. Of course, in the States, you've got certified sports dietitians, highly trained dietitians in sports dietetics. But, sports nutrition, performance nutrition falls into many scopes of practice, all the way down to PT, strength conditioning coaches. We all have different levels of involvement and what we can do within that area. But again, most educational programs are much more theory focused than they are in terms of applying the science into practice. So our program is very much about contextualizing the knowledge, how to go through the whole process of sourcing evidence, filtering that evidence, and then applying that evidence to inform your practice, all the way through to communication strategies and techniques and so on, to help deliver sort of confident, competent practitioners is kind of our approach. There just isn't anyone else doing that. There are many great graduate programs out there in sports nutrition. I'm not saying they're not. However, ours is very unique.
Right. Even looking at some of your social media, which anyone listening can follow on Instagram at the IOPN. On Instagram, I could see some of the posts that were created, right? Case study challenge. It seems like there are these very real world examples that you're trying to generate conversation around.
We love a case study. But that's the thing. That's what you deal with. You don't deal with generalized stuff. One thing that's important about working with athletes, even in a team setting, ultimately it's still N of one. You're still working with individuals, and we've got to stop this, applying generalized information just to anyone. Even if you look at your sort of the broad section of your client base or within a team, they're still individuals, and they will all vary in many different ways, from needs, preferences, ethnicity, metabolism, likes, dislikes, economical issues, wants, desires, responders, non-responders, although that's an interesting conversation in itself. But all this stuff is at the core of evidence-based practice. Is you've got to bear in mind all of these individualized contexts that a person will have. If you look at science, research is scientists publish averages, if you like, publish means. That's absolutely fine, but you need to learn how to read and interpret that science to try and tease out how meaningful this information is to your athlete. So, for example, if a research study was done on a bunch of college students, how applicable are those findings to an Olympic athlete, or to a 250-pound linebacker or whatever, when your research was done on a 65-kilogram college student. How relevant is this stuff? So it's really complicated.
There are so many ways I want to go with this, so I'm just going to try to chew it off bite by bite here, which is good. Like, I have so many ideas. So, okay, I kind of just want to hop into real world examples, because that caught my eye on your social media, and we're kind of in this discussion right now of individualization. So, all right, I'm an 18-year-old, football, soccer phenom with a ton of talent, but no real sense of what like performance or nutrition performance even is. I don't hydrate much. Like, where do you even start with your approach? I meet you, you're working for the team, you and I are having our first conversation. Like, obviously you're trying to get to know me, my background, things like this, maybe trying to tease out challenges or like roadblocks of my life. But tell me about how you just approach that.
Well, so whether this is your 18-year-old, football athlete, college superstar, whatever, or whether it's, your soccer mum, right? Often it's the same issue. The first thing is once you discover what they're doing, typically you'll discover they're doing everything except for the basics right. So, you've got sort of a top-down strategy or a bottom-up sort of strategy, and everyone's focus is things like, well, they can tell you what supplements they take. They can tell you that they've stopped eating carbohydrates. They can tell you that, they're doing this, they're doing that. But when it comes down to it, you ask them really basic questions, like, are you focusing on, and it's not very sexy, I have to say. This is like one of the challenges that the nutritionist will have is you've got to just go, hang on, hey, yeah, okay, right, that's all great. But are you mastering the basics, and what even are the basics, before you start getting all fancy and complicated, particularly with your 18-year-old, he's like, oh man, I'm smashing the protein shakes, and, I'm doing my benches and my deadlifts, and like, I'm making sure that I have my post-workout recovery, 1 second after the weights return back to the stack, and I'm on my creatine, I'm on my beta alanine, I'm on this, I'm on that, and they're like, well, how many vegetables do you eat? Carrots, is that a vegetable? Do you once you start delving into what they do, you realize that it's what they don't do that is the bigger, more challenging issue. So if you think about foundations, like foundations of a building, foundations of pretty much any kind of concept you want to get into, there's going to be a set of foundations. For nutrition, it's going to be things like, are you eating roughly the right amount of food in a given day? Not so easy to answer in a podcast because it's very individualized. But you start to look and see, are they getting enough food? Is it spread across 2, 3, 4 meals a day? Are they getting enough fruits and vegetables? Is there enough colors in there? Is there enough fiber? Is the nutrient quality of the food good, or are they eating a lot of processed, refined foods? Commonly a problem. It all tends to be fast foods. They're eating, maybe they're smashing the protein, but the protein's not from good sources. So you start to find all sorts of stuff out. So you have to correct those issues first, because as you start to work your way up this hierarchy of need, right, in terms of nutrition, at the very basis of this is enough energy, roughly the right distribution of macros, proteins, fats, carbohydrates, the quality of those proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, spread over enough meals. Doesn't matter so much yet in this conversation about timing or anything. Are they just getting it roughly right in any given day? Normally the answer is no. So you've got to focus on that, because they're all the other way around. They're all about, like I say, their supplements, and they're taking loads of supplements, and their focus is very much about the stuff that is what's on social media, and so on and so forth. So that's the first thing you have to focus on.
So how much time do you allow for change for somebody, right? This isn't an overnight thing, right? Like I'm a young 18-year-old athlete who's eating fast food. Laurent, you see me walking in with McDonald's breakfast sandwich the next day into the facility. And I mean, is this about creating small wins and knowing that this is going to take time?
Yes.
And then
Yeah.
also, right?
Yeah. The reason why I'm jumping in with yes is because, again, an early lesson I had to learn is one of the quickest ways to shut down the buy-in, the belief, the willingness of your client, your athlete, to engage with you is if you just walk in there as the food police, and you're like, you shouldn't be eating this, you shouldn't eat that, this is bad, that's horrible. Firstly, no one really likes to be criticized, right? The other thing is you're just coming in with a whole load of negatives, and just generally that doesn't work. So, like I said, I used the phrase the biggest lever to pull. You've just got to look at what they're doing. The first thing is just listen. What are you doing? Interesting. They might already be benching, huge weight. They might already be the fastest athlete on the pitch. You've got to bear in mind some of the realities of where this athlete already is. But either which way, you're looking at everything that they do, and then you're looking at all the things that you could manipulate and change. Some of which are worth changing and manipulating, some of which are not worth changing if they're really married to that practice, which we can talk about in a minute. But either which way, you need to just chip away at things. And the first thing you're going to have to do is work out, well, what's the most important area? What's going to have the biggest bang for the buck? What's the biggest lever I can pull? And often that is actually just getting the basics right. And not worrying about, okay, they might be taking supplements they don't need, but largely the supplements, they're probably not harmful unless they're a professional athlete and they're not tested for banned substances and various other things. They're unlikely to contain substances that are going to be massively detrimental to their athlete. However, it's probably a waste of money and or a distraction from all the other things that they should do. But yeah, going in saying stop this, stop that, stop this can have very negative psychological effects on your athlete, and they tend to not listen to you at that point. They tend to move on. And another thing while I'm thinking about it, is if you're gonna, let's say, and this is common, let's say your athlete is following some rather questionable practices that they've learned about on social media, which is really common, right? Their heroes are not you. Their heroes are people on social media. I used to have this problem all the time. Like particularly my Premier League football players, Premier League soccer players, and we're talking, they're all multimillionaires. They're extremely famous, extremely good at what they do. And you're the team nutritionist, you're not their superhero, right? But they are listening to people, whether it's their girlfriend's trainer, or their best buddy is, Ronaldo or somebody. So Ronaldo's got some pretty crazy nutrition things that he's into, but he's an epic football player. If it works for him, it must work for somebody else. Or so it could be stop eating carbs, or I'm taking this pill or this potion, or I'm vegan or whatever. It's a trend, it's a fad, maybe, but you just got to be careful with what you tell them not to do, because if it's something they believe in you're messing with their belief system, and that's a pretty serious problem too.
So, what advice do you have for giving like positive reinforcements, right? You talked about maybe avoiding this negative feedback immediately, but I feel like at the same time in the position that you're in, sometimes it can almost be like it's not genuine because they know that you're the nutritionist, and that's what you're there for. So, how do you really create like a positive reinforcement that feels very
So
genuine?
no, and this may not sound exciting to the listeners, right? But this is a serious problem you can run into, right? It doesn't matter what piece of paper you've got framed, on the wall. The athletes don't care about this stuff. There's going to be something about you and the way that you communicate information that is either going to turn them on or off. Okay. Now, you used a phrase earlier, which is this an instant thing or is it something that's going to take a bit of time? I found what worked for me was not getting into sports nutrition advice recommendations as soon as I got into the team. The first thing I would do is build relationships. I'd build not just relationships with the athletes, that can be difficult to begin with. I would find one or two athletes that I felt were the influencers on the team, the people that maybe if I get closer to them and work with them, maybe I can have them help me spread the message. It's a lot easier to get close to one or two players than it is to get in with the entire team. Go back to my presentations. It ain't going to work if you're trying to influence a whole team, but you can on a one-to-one basis. There are many opportunities that you will have to spark up conversations, and I've got a little black book, and in that black book I would make notes. A player's nickname, the name of his wife, girlfriend, his kids, his favorite sports team, just stuff, things that are opportunity. They provide you with, it's like a key to the door to that opportunity to engage with them. And you go, how's your brother wasn't well last week. It's like, what's that got to do with sports nutrition? It's got everything to do with it because you're a human trying to interact with another human. If you can't be a human, you're not going to be able to take it to the next level and have them actually follow any advice you've got because they don't like you. They don't want to know you. These barriers, you might have to get them in the corridor, sit next to them on the coach, on the plane, wherever. You've just got to work at developing these relationships. So that's one thing. The other thing is being an S&C coach. This was an advantage I had, I think, because I had already been an S&C coach. I knew how to talk to other S&C coaches, but that was very important. Was develop those relationships with what's called your community of practice. So your community of practice is your other coaches, team doctor, the chefs, the kit men, everyone, right? Everyone is either on your side or against you, basically. So being the nutritionist, you're probably the least embedded member of the team, or at least that's been my experience. There are now many full-time practitioners and so on, but ultimately you're not as part of the in crowd typically as the S&C coaches are. Get in with them, and they will understand the athletes. They'll know some of the stuff. Now, of course, you might find the S&C coaches are also singing from the wrong hymn sheet. S&C coaches will have their own ideas about what's right and wrong from nutrition and so on. So you've also got to make sure that you're all saying the same thing. You all have the same belief, and you can gently help people to understand your perspective and help provide some evidence as to why you feel people should do things. And ultimately, in fact, there was at Middlesex University. We got a very well known S&C professor, Anthony Turner. You guys might know who he is. He's constantly publishing in the NSCA journals. And I remember him in a class I was listening to. He made a point of saying you got to justify your role on the team. You got to justify your role to the athletes. You've got to justify your role to your colleagues and obviously to your bosses and your chain of command, so to speak, and also to yourself. So there's these little things that you can do, but it will initially come down to just having conversations, listening. It's like they say, you've got two eyes, two ears, one mouth. Watch, listen, do a little less talking and a lot more observing. Observation is hugely important to the next step of learning what to do and how to do something.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for that. And what I'm thinking here is how do you find the balance between evidence-based practices and what an individual says or feels is working really well for them. I imagine you're like, but I've always done this, Laurent.
Yeah.
I've always done this and it's really worked well for me. Where's the balance for you, even though if you know this may not be the best method?
So, Gabe, that's why I was saying. Well, let me just go. Firstly, although I use the word evidence-based practice a lot, as a practitioner, I prefer to take it to the next level where it's evidence informed practice. So I'm using evidence to inform my practice, my advice, my recommendations. And I like to take that to the athlete, the client, who will have ideas, beliefs, as we've already discussed. And those ideas and beliefs might well be, and often are, based on, amongst other things, the fact that they feel it's already working for them, right? That's a really difficult position to shift. If they're like, but it already works, I'm already doing well on this, so why should I change my path? So that's why I say you've got to listen first. Don't just smash their perspective. You know, you're onto a loser if you're going to have a go at their belief system, right? However, you can sit there and go, right, okay, I hear you. This is all great. However, there is another perspective here, and what you're doing is working for you, but I believe that there's a better way. Okay, I'm not saying what you're doing isn't working, but there is an even better way. Now, aren't you interested in that? If I could help you do something even better than what you're doing, would you be interested in talking about that? And they always are. They're always like, oh, okay, I'll give it a listen. And it might take a few conversations. That doesn't mean you start holding up peer-reviewed publications to the athlete. And I don't have a magic bullet because it is very individualized how you learn to communicate with each and every individual. But it's a conversation that starts somewhere, and it is not likely to be resolved in one engagement with your athlete. It's going to take a little bit of time. And again, the more they believe in you and the more confidence they have in you, then the more likely they are to move into slightly more uncomfortable places because they trust you. If they know that you have their best, whatever it is, you are 100% interested in what's right for them, and you genuinely want to help them be the best that they can, and you genuinely have put a lot of time and effort into determine what's right for them, you'll often find that they'll give you a shot.
Yeah,
But in the end,
I love the term you used, right? The switch from evidence-based to evidence-informed,
yeah,
which is great because it doesn't have to be so rigid, but we can use this evidence to help inform and make these decisions, make these processes we're already accustomed to even better, which I really like. Now, continuing the conversation with working with athletes, I'm curious about your perspective on working with athletes and the challenges that come with athletes from different countries and cultures
oh
who
man,
might be really accustomed to different types of foods
yeah,
and
yeah.
coming to a new environment and all of a sudden saying the food that I always knew and love is no longer here.
So I wasn't naive to this issue in as far as I was raised. My father was British of Scottish origin. My mother was French, right? I was raised in a British French household. I was already accustomed to different cuisines, different approaches to eating food. British cuisine being awful, French cuisine being amazing, but concepts like the quality of food presentation, the importance of meal times as not just an opportunity to eat, but it's also an opportunity to be with people. We're social creatures. And in a team setting, for example, that's critical. You know, yeah, you might have feeding strategies that are very individualized that you have, outside the weight room, on an aeroplane, on pitch or whatever. But it's very important to have athletes sit together and eat, or clients to eat with their family, or youth athletes to sit with, there's all sorts of stuff there. But, but, we've already mentioned individual needs and preferences. And there's no greater example than that is when you have international athletes in a team. And I've had many experiences of that, not just in US or UK professional team settings where you often will have multilingual, multi-ethnic people. But for example, in a typical Premier League, English Premier League soccer team, the joke being hardly anyone's actually English. They're from everywhere, right? Including the manager. The manager might be the German. The average teams are everywhere from Europeans, Chinese, Americans, even whatever. I mean, it's all sorts. Every single one of them came from a different part of the world. They're used to different foods. They all gravitate to eating different things in different ways. And a lot of it is, it reminds them of home. It's a comfort thing. It's not just fuel. We got to, problem with nutrition is we go on about calories, macros. No, it's food. Food is much more than just calories and energy. It's something that makes you happy. It's something that makes you sad if you miss it, right? Something that brings communities together. It's really important stuff. But nonetheless, it's a huge challenge when you've got 10, 15, 20 different nationalities sitting at the table and you've got to come up with foods to suit everyone, and yet still tick this is what the athletes need to, fuel up on its match day, game day -1. They're going to need higher carbohydrate. They're going to need recovery meals afterwards. It's off season, it's on season. And that, again, requires you to spend some time learning about your athletes. They're not just athletes, by the way. We keep calling them athletes. They're human beings. I think that's the first thing, is they're humans. And humans have crazy likes and dislikes, prejudices, fads that they're into. You've got all sorts there. So you have to learn to identify what people like, don't like, and work with the chef or the team chefs. And you've got to try and find a happy medium. That can be certainly challenging, and it's been very different in every environment that I work with. But if you don't bother to get some feedback from your athletes, if you don't bother to work out what people like and don't like. Doesn't matter how well designed your performance nutrition strategies are. I used the term earlier. It's all very well having information, but if you can't have implementation and application, it doesn't go anywhere. And oftentimes you'll have athletes who won't eat certain foods because they don't like them, or it doesn't meet their religious or ethnic beliefs or whatever. You've got a problem because you've then got an athlete who's underfueled or has gastrointestinal problems because they're being made to eat things they just don't tolerate. Underfueling is becoming more and more of a problem where athletes aren't eating enough food. But that all, again, it's the listen and observe, and then you keep adapting. We have to keep adapting, like you do as an S&C coach. Keep adapting your training program based on the actual real world situations that your athletes find themselves in.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool. We had the opportunity to go visit Liverpool and go see their new facility.
Oh, great.
And yeah, you could see, and I went with Keiser, and you could see in the cafeteria they
You meet
had
Mona, the nutritionist there.
so we just visited the cafeteria. We
Oh, right,
didn't
yeah,
visit
great.
specifically with the nutritionist, but you could see even in that area when you walk through the facility,
Amazing.
you get there, and I believe there were the flags of all the different players,
Yeah.
home countries, and it made for a really welcoming and inviting place because these people are not home. They're from all these different areas, and what makes everybody different ultimately brings them together. But like you mentioned, food and the culture surrounding food is so impactful for everyone. Everyone has their own unique experience, whether that reminds them of home or growing up. So I thought it was really cool, and it really struck me that they brought that into the cafeteria area, which I thought was really, really cool.
Yeah, I mean, an obvious challenge to that is, in that scenario, you're talking about a club with massive resources financially. So, and a lot of the teams I've worked for have been, they've been the best teams on the planet. They've got massive resource. They put huge amounts of money. The chefs are Michelin-starred chefs. This is serious, and we fly ingredients. We go to the best markets. We get, huge sums of money are spent on that food. However, if you do not have those resources, you can still adapt anything to better suit the needs and preferences of your athletes. You just got to observe and talk and watch. See, in the States, when I was in the States, of course, because all very well I was talking about international, but of course in countries like the US, which is such a big country, you've got lots of people from different parts of the US, and of course you've got very different food likes and dislikes in your country, and that alone is an issue. You know, I spent a lot of time down in New Mexico, for example, and got to love all the chili and the New Mexican cuisine. But of course, that was radically different from when I was up north, in New York and places like that. Completely different types of cuisine. but you can still adapt. That's the great thing about the modern world we live in. Most things are available, but if you don't actually know what people like and don't like, you can't do anything about it.
Absolutely. I'm starting to get hungry as our conversation goes,
Yeah, me
but
too.
I don't know how you do so many podcast episodes. I'm like, that sounds good. You said chili. I was like, okay, yeah.
Oh man, well, there you go. Yeah.
um, so pivoting from these scenarios in which you can't necessarily always observe, you can't always talk and watch. We talked a lot about working in a team environment and with athletes. Now I want to pivot into working with individuals, your
Yep.
gym bros, your weekend warriors, athletes, where sure, you're talking with them and having check-ins and conversations, but you're not always there. You're not observing from afar. They
No.
have their own lives. So talk to me about kind of your approach or some of the challenges of working with one-on-one or really the private sector with
So
consulting.
yeah, and that's I've done. If anything, I've done more of that. That's for many years, and that's actually where my focus now is in helping nutritionists and nutrition coaches and health and fitness professionals work more either in group coaching or nutrition coaching type environments. Because this is where more people are going to find themselves. Very few people will end up advising nutrition to elite sports teams. So the challenges are huge when you're working with individuals because out of sight is out of mind. So, if you're not there, which you're not going to be for the most part, you've got to find different ways of developing accountability with your client. And nowadays, there are great ways to do that. You can have people do anything from using things like MyFitnessPal to track, although I'm not such a fan of tracking in the usual sense of the term for various reasons, including the perceived accuracy of that is not particularly accurate. You think it's accurate, but it's not very accurate. We can get into that if we have time later. But people can take photos, they can write food diaries, there's all sorts of things. But the more disengaged that they are from the process, the more wild and crazy they go with things. So you need to have degrees of accountability. Now, though you mentioned check-ins, check-ins is a powerful thing. Once a week, you should always have a weekly check-in. Invariably, it's not going to be face-to-face in your office. That can be expensive, it's impractical, but you can do that on WhatsApp. You can do it using coaching applications. There are many that exist out there. But a weekly check-in is extremely powerful. But over and above your weekly check-in, which is an opportunity for you to see how they're doing, they know that at the end of the week they've got to report back and tell you something. Whether they tell you what you want to hear or what they think you should hear is another conversation. But nonetheless, it's that weekly follow-up situation. What I like to do though is have a sort of a test don't guess scenario. And depending on the way your practice is set up, your office is set up, the technology you have available, there are various additional layers of this sort of test don't guess and accountability that you can introduce. Very basic one, of course, is daily weigh-ins. You can just have them weigh first thing in the morning every day. That'll provide you with some degree of trend on total body weight, which can be pretty useful depending on what you're trying to achieve. All the way through to they might have access to much more sophisticated methods of body composition analysis, which again, I said if it's recreational athletes, 9 times out of 10, that's going to be a huge thing they're interested in is their body composition. But yes, their performance will be important. If they're triathletes or whatever, they're already using 1,000 million metrics, gadgets and technology to look at their fitness and their power and their all bits and bobs they have from their smartwatches to their power meters and all sorts of things. That's usually not what the nutritionist has to get involved in. Body fat, muscle mass, these are the things that tend to be more interesting. So you might have access to clinics that provide DEXA body comp assessments, which you might do, say, once a quarter, every 3 months. Not so easy in the UK. We have much more restrictions on being able to do these things, but we do have private clinics now doing DEXA tests. But in the States, I found it much easier to get my clients to get DEXA assessments. You've got people that are highly trained in using skin fold calipers, using the Isaac methodology. Got to be careful with skin folds. You need to know how to use them and where to put them on the body. That isn't just a case of I've got skin folds and let's measure. That can be wildly inaccurate and misleading. Bioimpedance analysis is where you stand on a scale or hold some handles and it gives you some information about body composition. I would say very, very varied results can be taken from that. There's different bits of kit out there. Some are much more accurate than others. That's not really the purpose of my chat today, but you just have to bear in mind evidence informed. Well, how reliable and robust is that evidence, i.e., my weight, my body fat level, that I'm using to inform my understanding of where I am today? Am I making improvements? Am I making gains? Am I going backwards? Like, what's going on? The accuracy of this information is highly influential. But it's very powerful as a motivating tool to have this information, whether it's body comp data, blood work, weigh-ins, all of which are presented at these check-ins, whether it's in office or via some remote methodology. That way, both you as a practitioner and your client is constantly focused on the outcome. And the outcome is, for example, losing body fat, gaining. On a regular basis, you need to understand, am I going in the right direction? And if I'm not, I need to discuss that with my client, because they're going to need some counseling. They're going to need some troubleshooting. They're going to often need some calming down. Oftentimes you'll find, oh my God, it's not working, and they'll blame anything but themselves, right? And it might be that you gave them the wrong advice. Often it's because they're not following your advice regularly or properly or whatever. And that needs observation. You've got to listen, you've got to observe. And there's a big skill set there, because you will often find that understanding what people are actually doing is not so easy to understand. Particularly in nutrition, it's much easier in the weight room. You can see, you can measure and observe how much somebody's lifting, what they're doing. Nutrition is way more complicated. But those weekly check-ins are absolutely critical. But constant feedback and refining and fine-tuning often will get you in the right direction. Big mistake I made early in my career is I'd give somebody a nutrition plan, and 3 months later I'd say, come back and see me. You wouldn't see them 3 months later because they didn't get the results that they wanted. So you need to have that constant feedback mechanism. It's like flying a plane. You've got that constant, you're being pulled in a different direction, so you constantly correct, and eventually you'll land where you want to land. Otherwise, you get massively deviated on your path.
Yeah, and it goes back to this idea of buy-in too, right? The hey, come back and see me in 3 months, or hey, Laurent is checking in with me once a week, and I have time in the schedule because he cares.
Trust and buy-in.
Yeah,
Care, complete. Gabe, that is such an important part of the puzzle, particularly in things like nutrition. You've got to demonstrate that you genuinely care about the troubles and strifes that your client's going through, and you genuinely care about finding a solution to those problems. And you need to illustrate the fact that it's not going to be perfect to begin with. We're going to have some things that work. We're going to have some things that don't work, and that's just normal. But if you don't have regular check-ins, if you don't have regular chats, conversations, whether it's messaging, you're never going to develop that sort of care, buy-in, practitioner-patient relationships. Absolutely critical to get
yeah.
the outcomes that you're after.
We have time for a couple more questions. And earlier you mentioned supplements, right? I believe you said people actually talk more about what they are doing, and it's really about what they aren't doing. And that kind of led into you mentioning supplements. So supplements are always a hot topic, right? Me as a strength and conditioning coach, I get people all the time, what should I be taking? What should I, and I go back to, okay, well, I go back to are you sleeping? Are you eating breakfast? Are you hydrating? Let's start there maybe. But everyone's always curious, do we really need them? So how do you help athletes or individuals that aren't maybe even athletes separate what's useful from what's just noise?
Great question. So this is complicated because it depends on what question you're asking and in what context, how many gray areas do we want to have in this? Right. So do you need supplements? Almost certainly no. You don't need them. Define supplement, firstly. Define need. A lot of this will depend on who you are and what level you're at. The average person rarely needs supplements, right? However, if they are vegan, if they are vegetarian, if they have some reason to heavily restrict their intake of food, if they're extremely fussy, if they are unable to access quality foods. I mean, there are many places in this world, US, UK even, where access to high quality produce is not an option. They might not be able to afford these things. Sometimes it's cheaper to supplement. Sometimes it's more practical to supplement. There's all sorts of scenarios there. But if we can differentiate, need from what works and what doesn't work, right? So we've already got that hierarchy of need. If you get all the basics right, chances are you probably don't need the supplements. They're like sprinkles on the cake more than the cake itself. There's one or two that you could argue are way more important than others, like creatine monohydrate. In fact, the more we learn about creatine, the more exciting it gets beyond its capacity to improve outcomes for strength and conditioning, cognitive health, cognitive function. Other areas that I found interesting with creatine, for example, is the impact it has on glycogen replenishment strategies. All sorts of cool stuff you can do with creatine. You've got your vitamin D for people who, for various reasons, either due to ethnicity or due to where they live on the planet, there's no sunshine sort of scenario. There's an argument there. Protein supplements and carbohydrates tend to be the two biggies that people just completely misunderstand. You can almost always get enough protein through food. Again, is a protein supplement food or is it a supplement? Where does that one go? Certain foods are very high in protein: meat, fish, eggs, some dairy like cottage cheese, Greek yogurt, stuff like that. You can normally meet your needs. Even the biggest of football players, etc., rugby players, I've found can meet it through food. It just may not be practical to do that.
Right.
Due to travel, you can't cook a steak whilst you're in an aeroplane. You're on the coach. You can't travel on the train necessarily. So there's different scenarios, and it just depends on the situation you're at. Maybe because you're not at home, you're not in the team cafeteria or whatever. Maybe it's a strategy to compensate for the challenges that you have. Particularly large athletes and bodybuilders who might be augmented, they're using steroids, etc. There may be an increased argument for them to have additional supplemental protein. It just depends on your needs. Fish oils, if you don't eat fish ever, or rarely, if you're vegan, vegetarian, and you're not eating enough foods that provide you with the substances that will enable your body to manufacture essential fatty acids, it all gets very challenging. These are arguments for some supplements, but on the whole, I would say more often times than not, you don't actually need supplements, which is quite an interesting conversation to have.
Question for you. I have a severe fish allergy, and as well as shellfish. Fish oil to me is essentially a cyanide. So I've heard people recommend like algae or krill or something like not krill, algae maybe. Is that a reasonable substitution?
I don't know, and the reason why I don't know is because the evidence doesn't really answer that question very well. What is interesting is if you properly look at all the evidence, it's not very convincing that any of these supplements are actually of any particular value. There's a lot of bad science out there, I'm afraid. And by bad science, it's like if you really learn how to read and interpret the quality and relevance of science, it's really scary how bad a lot of it is. A lot of interpretations are made from very weak data and or completely awful, terribly conducted studies. It's got nothing to do with who funded the study and all those sorts of things that people might argue. It's just, it's very difficult to conduct science. Researchers get a lot of shtick for the quality of their science, particularly in sports science, strength conditioning. We can't get the sort of numbers of people into our studies that public health studies will have, hundreds of thousands of people. We're,
Right.
we're lucky to get a dozen. An epidemiologist is going to look at that and go, you have nowhere near enough data to draw any conclusions. And to a certain extent, they're right. Hence, I love case studies, you see. So
Right.
you yourself are a case study. You can't do fish. You can't do your fish oil omega-3 cyanide pills. And yet here you are. You look to me like you're a healthy individual. You seem to be doing okay. What is it you're doing is maybe the question I should be asking. And maybe you're not doing anything, and therefore that illustrates, well, maybe it's not actually as important as we once thought.
Oh, I appreciate the insight. You can send me an invoice after the episode. So,
There you go,
um,
consult done. Just quickly while we're there, there's all this energy, there's all this noise out there. We should all be, consuming huge amounts of protein. We should all be cutting
right.
carbohydrates. We should all be doing supplements, fish oils, and so on. But actually, should we? It's a very individualized situation, and you can
Yeah.
argue either which way. Normally, even for elite athletes, it comes down to it depends.
Yeah, it's really hard to have this should we, and it's really like should you. And because the you part really requires a ton of context for somebody's situations. Going back to the n equals one kind of,
Always n equals one. Always.
yeah, no question. So you talked about research, you talked about quality research, poor research. For anybody listening, what are some of the, resources you like to turn to, excuse me, for quality research?
Well, we have things called consensus statements, and if there's enough evidence on a given topic or a range of topics, like in sports nutrition, for example, for topics that we have a lot more confidence in, you'll find there's a consensus statement. So there are a variety of bodies that produce consensus statements, and in sports nutrition, that will be things like the ACSM, IOC consensus statements on things like nutrition and sports nutrition, but also supplements. Um, there's all sorts of bodies out there. The ISSN I've mentioned earlier, they've done a whole bunch of position sound statements. I've co-authored a few of those, like on diets and body composition, for example, is one that I've done, but I've done quite a few. Those consensus papers are based on very robust data that's been interpreted appropriately and has had multiple layers of filtering by people who actually know what they're talking about, right? Hence the large numbers of people often involved in the production of these consensus statements. A consensus statement is relevant, for example, to sports nutrition rather than just being a randomized controlled study that's for, an entire nation. It's very hard to tease out what's relevant. Remember my favorite words, relevant, Gabe.
Right.
So there's a lot there that you can see in consensus statements. That would be my first place to go. The other place to go, of course, is to a well-trained, well-educated individual like you or me, who can then help further contextualize this, and hopefully they are a person who, beyond their training and education, is also able to know when they don't know the answer and are then able to further refer to the relevant expert and or sources of information, because it is a little bit complicated. There are obviously places like our podcasts and various other things. They are not specific to your own personal needs, is the point.
Right.
But there are degrees of consensus. But anyone can do a podcast, obviously.
Yeah,
Um,
of course, I'm doing one.
However, anyone can do an Instagram post. Anyone with a six pack, anyone that calls themselves a nutrition coach or whatever, anyone can do these things. So I think ultimately the individual needs to have a responsibility also to try and differentiate quality from flawed sources of information, and just have a think, where's this stuff coming from, and are they really the right people for me to learn from? Just because they look the part, just because what they're saying sounds right, does it really mean that they're the person I really should listen to and follow all of their advice and recommendations? Because at the end of the day, changing your lifestyle, changing your nutrition can have real influences on your health and well-being, and can be pretty serious. Not just your performance. Okay, you don't win the race. Okay, you don't lose weight. It could be much worse than that. You could end up with a serious health condition by following the wrong advice. So it does matter where you get your information from.
Absolutely. And a great place to find that information, I'll plug it, as the Institute of Performance Nutrition. So,
Yes,
um,
indeed. And me, of course. I'll caveat. There's I also have my own channel, Dr. Bannock. You just put in my name, Laurent Bannock. You'll find me on there. But at the IOPN, we're more focused specifically on the training and education of current and aspiring sport and exercise nutritionists.
One question for you, and then just a couple of
Yeah.
fun ones to finish up here. So, as you look at nutrition, you've been involved in nutrition for a very long time, in health and performance for a very long time.
Yeah.
What I'm going to ask this in kind of two different ways. So, either one, what excites you most about the future of performance nutrition, over the next 10 to 20 years, or perhaps is there an area of nutrition that is not well studied or really underappreciated that you think will take form in the later
Great
years?
questions. 20 years from now, Gabe, I'm gonna not be doing any of this. I'm gonna be sitting in my second home in the south of France drinking wine, going, I used to do this stuff and I don't care about body composition anymore. So I'm not thinking 20 years ahead. But I love this topic because nutrition is such an important part of what influences health, performance, training adaptations. You think health, performance, training adaptations, that's a big deal. Is it the most important thing? No. But in the same way, what's more important, your left leg or your right leg? I mean, this is kind of a silly question. It's part and parcel of what we do. So I love nutrition. It's evolving, constantly evolving. And what are the areas that I think are really exciting? I think as technology improves and we start to learn how to understand body what the individual body's needs are. Things like, if we could truly learn glycogen levels, if we could truly learn nutritional status at the cellular level, I mean, properly, particularly on the pitch in your office, without involving big labs and various other things, like genetics. There are tests and so on for genetics and nutrition and so on. I don't believe they're there yet, but we're going to get there. And very soon, our ability to provide truly personalized advice based on evidence to inform our recommendations will just get better and better and better and better as time goes by. And that's the wonders of where we're at. Technology keeps going in the right direction, and so will what we learn and what we can apply. And that will give us more and more buy-in. There's nothing like a set of test results and you go, okay, I shouldn't have fish oil because it might kill me. You don't have to actually try it to find it out.
That's really cool. I know there are a lot of companies now, especially with a lot of genetic companies, a lot of biomedical companies out there. So I am curious to see where maybe this study of and um, investment in genetics and understanding genetics better will take us. And I'm thinking about you 20 years from now, sitting, in the south of France, and I wrote this down now. I wrote down the phrase "taste informed drinking" with your wine,
I'm
and
going to have a vineyard, Gabe, so I will be
and
doing
then this is what I wrote here. And then now you're going to be lecturing or telling people, or going to be passionate about what's relevant to the production of wine.
I'm going to become a yeah. I think that's going to be my next career, Gabe. Why not? Evidence informed wine drinking. There you go.
Yeah, there you go. So, and then just like, your friend who had mentioned something to you, Brad, about creating something like this, you will look back to me and say, Gabe actually said that I should be doing this, in my vineyard. So, um,
Yeah, well, I'll dedicate a special edition of wine with your name on it.
all right. So this is a really tough question for me to always answer. So I'm going to ask it a different way. What are some of your favorite foods, dishes that you really, really love and enjoy?
Well, depending on so genuinely, I do like my wine, and I will often think about the wine that I want, and then I'll pair the food with the wine. So, for example, like a good steak, will match very well with a wine. I love all kinds of cuisine. I do love what in France is a basic staple of steak frite, steak and chips with a good wine. I mean, it just, with a really good salad, it's just epic. All the right macros are met, high protein, appropriate carbohydrate, it's all there. Definitely stimulates the leucine threshold. I get my protein synthesis comes off the back of that. Um, we mentioned chili. I have a massive weakness for chili, Gabe. Love chili, spicy chili food. Whether it's like in the UK, we're obsessed with Indian food. So good good curry. But yeah, chili, anything with chili in it. I love chili. The hotter the better, frankly.
I was just talking about steak frites last night with some friends. We were actually getting ready to go to dinner. In Chicago, we have really great Italian food. That's where I'm
Yeah.
based out of right now. So we had a nice big Italian meal last night. Still thinking about it. But yeah, steak frites to me, we were telling each other how perfect like that dish is.
Oh,
Like
I
it
love
just,
steak fries.
there's
Well, you mentioned
nothing, there's no
Chicago.
weakness. There's no weakness in that dish.
The first time I went to Chicago, it's a few years ago now. I can't remember where it was, but it was some famous place for getting the ultimate deep pan pizza. It was epic. I mean, it was no, I'd never had a pizza like it, you know? I'm sure there's other things in Chicago, but I do remember that. It sticks in my mind 20 years later.
Yeah, there's some famous ones. There's Pete Quads, there's Gino's East, Lou Malnati's. Those are the kind of like the classic
I can't
ones
remember which
that,
one, but yeah, it's still there.
yeah.
But you know, in all seriousness, that's the power of food, right? We love food. So it's not protein, it's not carbohydrates. We talk about pizza, we talk about steak, and the feelings that it draws for us is epic, isn't it? That's nutrition, man. That's nutrition.
Well, that, and you were talking earlier about the impact of food and having meals with other people. And, I was with 8 friends or so, and it's this old school Italian restaurant with the red and white paper cloth, all of the photos of all the famous people,
Right.
Michael Jordan, all that stuff. You see it on the wall. And like that is part of the dining experience. It's like, look at all of these people who have come here to enjoy this like amazing Italian comfort food. So my mind
I'm
was definitely thinking
also,
about that.
well, it's not just my mind, I am now hungry. So
Yeah.
it's time for me to go eat.
All right, well, we can end it. So, thank you, Dr. Laurent Bannock of the Institute of Performance Nutrition. Thank you so much for joining me on the Keiser Human Performance Podcast. If you're listening today, you want to learn more, like I mentioned, you can visit www.theiopn.com. You can follow the IOPN on Instagram. And then, Laurent, for you, you have your own channels as well. Where can people follow you?
If you just put in Laurent Bannock, Laurent Bannock, you'll find me on Instagram, etc. I'm pretty easy to find. Dr. Laurent Bannock. There's only one Dr. Laurent Bannock on the planet, so that's kind of handy for me. And I'd be glad to share what I have to share with anyone that wants to listen.
Awesome. And for those that did listen in today, we hope you're not too hungry right now. Thank you and have an awesome day.